Friedrich Nietzsche is among the most influential thinkers of the 19th century. But what would you say is his most influential idea? Is it his critique of Christianity, or his writings on power, or his proclamation that God is dead and we have killed him? You could make an argument for any of these. But I think that his most impactful ideas are actually found in his picture of the human mind and his study of human psychology. And this is just what we'll be exploring today. Before we get started, I just want to clarify that I obviously can't give a complete analysis of Nietzsche's psychology in one short video. This is just a general introduction to the topic. I would also be remiss in not telling you the main piece of secondary scholarship that I will be citing today, which is Paul Katsanafis's brilliant monograph, The Nietzschean Self. It's one of the greatest books on Nietzsche that I have ever read, and I'll be drawing from it heavily in this video. Get ready to dive into the terrifying world of Nietzschean psychology. My name is Joe Foley, and this is Unsolicited Advice. 1. The depths of the unconscious. On the face of it, Nietzsche's psychology consists in a series of truly extraordinary seeming claims. You might have heard that he thought the will did not exist, or that everyone just desired power, or that we are all secretly incredibly cruel and malicious. As we shall see, none of these headline-making claims are quite as they appear. But the most important part of Nietzsche's psychology is also maybe its least controversial part, though it has only become less controversial long after Nietzsche's death. The vital concept for understanding Nietzsche here is the unconscious. This is a pretty well-known idea now, that we have a conscious set of experiences that we are aware of, and an unconscious set which lurks beneath the surface, influencing us in some way. We will get to the influencing part of the unconscious later, but something Katsafinas points out is that Nietzsche distinguishes between consciousness and unconsciousness not only along the lines of awareness, as we would intuitively think, but also conceptual content or conceptualization. Nietzsche sort of conceives of the relationship between the unconscious and the conscious mind as us having the raw material of unconscious experience, which is then filtered through our concepts, and then a distorted version of that enters our awareness. It is more complex than that, but this is just the aspect that we will focus on for this section. An example might help. Take the following image. This is known as the rabbit-duck illusion. It's an image that can be looked at as either a rabbit or a duck. They really pulled out all of the stops when they named it. If you notice, as you shift between perceiving it as a duck and as a rabbit, your actual perceptions will change, as the concepts you organize your perceptions around also change. Nietzsche conceives of perception and consciousness more generally, roughly along these lines. He thinks that all of our perceptions are already run through with concepts by the time that you encounter them in your conscious awareness. It's what makes you perceive a mug as a mug rather than as a cup and a handle, or just a collection of disconnected atoms. Funnily enough, this chimes quite well with some modern psychological and neuroscientific findings, which talk about how our expectations, beliefs, and concepts heavily influence not only how we interpret situations and interpret sense data, but how we actually experience that sense data on a visceral, pre-interpretive level. Importantly, Nietzsche thinks that these concepts can begin to distort this raw experience that's provided to us via the unconscious and our senses. The reason for this is partly just because there is far too much information being taken in at any given moment for us to process it all. So we use concepts to organize and make sense of this raw experience. However, those concepts also transform our experiences in potentially distortive ways. For instance, if it's part of my conceptual scheme that people called Jim are angry people, then I am more likely to interpret anything a Jim does as potentially aggressive. Some of these can sound quite straightforward, but at the time Nietzsche was writing, this was incredibly groundbreaking, and I would argue that we very rarely grapple with its true radical implications today. If Nietzsche is right, then our unconscious mind affects so much of how we interpret reality, which is why it's so important to be aware of your biases. And if you're interested in doing just this, then you should check out today's very kind sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a website and app that gathers related articles from thousands of sources around the world in one place, so you can compare how different outlets cover the same story. Each story comes with a clear breakdown of the political bias, factuality, ownership, and headlines of the reporting sources, with ratings backed by independent news monitoring organizations. Ground News are very kindly offering anyone who uses my link or scans my QR code 40% off their Vantage plan as a special deal. So I highly encourage you to snap this up. For instance, let's see how left and right-wing publications differed on reports that President Trump is thinking of pardoning Sean Diddy Combs. Whereas left-wing sources emphasized those who talked about the potential alienating effects this could have on young female voters, right-wing sources chose to emphasize the reasoning behind the idea that Trump thought the conviction had been unfair. I especially like the blind spots feed, which highlights stories that are disproportionately covered by either the left or the right. This feed helps readers step into the other side's news reality and understand the different narratives that can shape their beliefs, such as left-wing news sources missing a dressing down given by Cory Booker to his fellow Democratic senators, or right-wing sources missing claims that Trump's name had been deliberately redacted from Epstein-related files. I just don't have a lot of time to keep up with the news, and certainly not to examine every single article I read for bias. So receiving my Ground News Roundup at the end of every single day means that I can get a variety of different news opinions, learn which sources to trust, and make the world less of a bewildering mess, which all help to avoid the natural cognitive biases that would lead me astray. Ground News is giving my viewers 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. They have genuinely become my go-to news source, and I sincerely hope that you'll check them out. But anyway, back to the video. Nietzsche was also revolutionary in proposing the unconscious as potentially more powerful than the conscious mind, and that it might influence us in a myriad ways that we were simply not aware of. The main way that this occurs is through drives, and we'll say an awful lot more about that in the next section. But my point here is just that Nietzsche thinks that much of our mind is contained within the unconscious, and that he thought we had not, and possibly still have not, yet begun to really appreciate just how significant that this concept and conception really is. In our general life, we tend to think that we are pretty good judges of why we do things, what we think, what we believe, and how we feel. Partly, this is because other people tend to not be in a position to correct us about these things. But there is also a long tradition in both pre-19th century philosophy and pre-19th century psychology, which claim that we have privileged access to the contents of our own minds. In its more extreme forms, this suggested that our motives, desires, thoughts, beliefs, and feelings were just obvious to us. Other people's minds might be mysterious, but our own are perfectly open to view. Although much of our scientific and philosophical literature has moved far beyond this, we still often implicitly hold on to this idea in popular discourse. We act as if we know our own minds, and that we know why we do things and why we think things. But Nietzsche's picture of the mind implies a very different idea, around which the rest of Nietzsche's philosophy of mind and psychology revolves. It suggests that there might be much of our mind that is totally opaque to us. This insight will go on to inspire Freud and many more psychoanalysts, and the general Nietzschean picture of the unconscious is still floating around in modern psychology today, albeit in a highly altered form. And much of Nietzsche's darker implications for human nature, the human mind, and human behavior play on this idea that what motivates our behavior, values, and a hell of a lot more is often secret from us, and maybe much less noble than we initially assumed. Take one classic Nietzschean idea, that our Christian-influenced morality, with its concern for the weak and powerless and heaven where good people can enter however materially unsuccessful they were in life, and its praise of pity and meekness, stemmed originally from an unconscious resentment at feeling powerless and being dominated by more powerful people. Nietzsche doesn't claim that this was a conscious scheme by the powerless, but that it was the natural result of their frustrated desire for power. Nietzsche sometimes insinuates that this same kind of underlying psychological force is still influencing the continued existence of such moralities today. This is just one example of the kind of argument that is facilitated by this specifically Nietzschean picture of the mind, and it's one that we'll come back to later. It's easy to see how this general idea has highly influenced our own thinking about psychology today, especially in a therapeutic context. Take therapists who work in attachment theory. There, if someone has an avoidant attachment style, meaning that they feel smothered easily, that they crave independence to an excessive degree, and struggle to be vulnerable with a partner, then the therapist might ask about that person's childhood. They might find that the person was held at arm's length as a child, and so learnt to depend only on themselves for their emotional needs. They might refer to this as an unconscious pattern that this person continues to play out in their adult relationships. This is the kind of analysis that Nietzsche's psychology lays significant groundwork for. It only works once we accept the idea that a large part of our mind, including groups of desires, beliefs, and behavioral patterns, are out of our conscious view and can only be conceptualized and learnt about with additional effort, if at all. This is a far cry from the near-total privileged access of many philosophies past. And, for better or for worse, this general Nietzschean insight has become pretty mainstream now. Lastly, Katsafanos points out that since the unconscious mind is non-conceptual in Nietzsche, this leaves it open for it to contain contradictions and tensions that would probably be rooted out in an explicit conceptual structure. This has, again, heavily influenced the development of psychology. It allows for us to have conflicting unconscious desires, which can then cause stress, discomfort, or dissonance. So this Nietzschean model of the mind, where the unconscious is beneath awareness and can be misunderstood as it is conceptualized by the conscious mind, is both philosophically groundbreaking for the time and has been hugely psychologically influential today. It is arguably Nietzsche's most historically impactful idea. But there is an aspect of the unconscious that absolutely pervades Nietzsche's work, so much so that it definitely deserves a closer look. 2. Drives, affects, and the will. Reading Nietzsche, you get an awful lot of talk about drives, wills, and emotions or affects. In just the genealogy of morals, you get the will to cruelty, the herd instinct, and various different unconscious drives that are meant to explain people's behaviors and their values. But what are these, and how do they work? How do they explain our behavior in the way Nietzsche wants them to? Well, for Nietzsche, a drive is something like a piece of your unconscious mind that wants to tug your actions in a particular direction and induce particular feelings or evaluations. In the work of Nietzsche scholar Matteo Riccardi, drives are behavioral dispositions. They are genuinely psychological/mental, brackets evaluative, and they have an urging nature. One example of this is the aforementioned drive towards cruelty in the genealogy of morals. For Nietzsche, there is an aspect of our psyche that seeks expression in cruelty. It desires to be cruel and is attempting to drive our behavior in this way. Nietzsche argues that we have hundreds of these kinds of drives that could pull us in different directions. We might have a drive towards unity with others, as well as a drive towards independence, and a drive to procreate, and a drive to continue living. The relative strength and influence of these drives will differ in different people. Nietzsche sometimes makes the argument that any drive that is consciously or unconsciously repressed will ultimately turn inwards and start to gnaw away at us, which, as you can imagine, then influence later psychoanalytic thinkers. The primary point that Nietzsche drives home, again and again, is that we are often ignorant of the precise ways in which these unconscious drives are affecting our behavior and our judgments. You might be able to see a theme here that very much links with the first section. Katsafanos points out that he inherited this from Schopenhauer's analysis of the reproductive drive. In The World as Will and Representation, Schopenhauer has a very extended discussion of the drive to reproduce and how it influences our behavior in unseen ways. For example, he states that while the reproductive drive is behind our experiences of love or attraction or romantic bonding, it nonetheless disguises itself in order to achieve these aims. It affects your perception so that you see someone as extraordinarily beautiful or lovely or charming. It makes you fall in love and amplifies the good qualities of your beloved in your mind. It might make you more patient with them or more kind. None of this means that those feelings are not real and significant, but for Schopenhauer, they are ultimately explained by the reproductive drive. That is the force behind those feelings. This illustrates another quality of Nietzschean drives. They present themselves as justified and warranted to us in order to influence our actions and our evaluations further. Katsafanos's favorite example of this is the drive to aggression. We all know people who are particularly aggressive, or in Nietzsche's terms, have a strong or dominant drive to aggression. One of the strange things about people like this is that they don't often perceive themselves as having an aggressive character. Instead, they will tend to talk about how the world is supremely irritating or in some sense warrants their aggression. They will be more likely to perceive neutral behavior as insulting, and so will actively be seeking out situations where they can behave aggressively. Thus, the drive does not just change how someone behaves directly, it also changes how they evaluate or value the world. This is why drives are such an important feature of Nietzsche's account of how we come to have our values. He thinks that the reason we value one thing over another is because it is the aim of some of our more dominant drives. This notion of an aim is very important. The aim of a drive, for Katsafanos's Nietzsche, is to discharge itself. So the aim of an aggressive drive is to behave aggressively, and the aim of a reproductive drive is to reproduce. This is distinct from what Katsafanos calls the object of the drive, which is its target in that moment. An aggressive drive's aim is to be aggressive, but its object might be the person who just looked at you funny from across the bar, or the traffic on the way home from work. Katsafanos's full explication is much more technical than this, and this is ultimately a distinction that he is borrowing from Freud that he thinks applies to Nietzsche's philosophy, but you get the general idea. This is absolutely vital for understanding Nietzsche's analysis of our ethical systems. When he analyzes Christian ethics as stemming from resentment, he is claiming that it stems from a resentful drive. That is one reason he condemns it. Much of Nietzsche's critique of Christianity or humanism or Kantianism or many of the other philosophical schools that get in his way are not based on traditional direct attacks on their propositional contents, but rather this claim that they stem from a particular contingent psychological drive, and so don't have the grounds to say that they are universal, and may even have some pretty ignoble origins. This is why so much of Nietzsche's ethical discussion is framed in terms of psychology. He thinks that the best way to explain the emergence of a given ethical system is not in terms of the arguments given for and against it, which he thinks are largely irrelevant to why people actually choose to follow any particular ethical system. Instead, he wants to explain them in terms of human psychology. Nietzsche thus contains the nascent form of the modern field of moral psychology, which investigates many of the same questions. Importantly, Nietzsche does not think that our conscious minds are just slaves to these drives, but nor does he think that our conscious mind has a kind of deciding vote on what we do. Instead, we can think of the mind as a little bit like a swimming pool of different forces, or as Katsafanos puts it, a vector field. We have all of these conflicting drives or non-conflicting drives bubbling away in our unconscious, and our conscious mind also has some say in what we end up doing, but it doesn't have the final say. It is considered as one voice among many. The conscious mind may play more of a role in some people than others, but unlike, say, Kant, Nietzsche does not think it is the king presiding over a realm of obedient subjects, but one MP in a broad parliament. Nietzsche's ultimate goal for these drives is for them to be unified. That's his recommendation to us. And there is significant disagreement over exactly what he means here. For some, unification means the dominance of one drive over all of the others. For other thinkers, it's a form of self-awareness and self-understanding. Personally, I like the interpretation that uses the metaphor of musical harmony. Within a given piece of music, excluding atonal works, there are keys which organize the different notes into a roughly coherent musical structure. It allows us to make sense of it. It's not that one particular note absolutely dominates, but rather that each note is put in its proper place to serve an overall musical and harmonic goal. To translate this back into Nietzsche's psychology, we can think of the organization of the will as more of a scale of mastery, where each drive is acting in a complementary fashion with many other drives. For example, in a great artist like Goethe, who Nietzsche is an enormous fan of, various different drives, including aggression, creativity, lust, love, hatred, frustration, and more, are channeled into his work, and anyone who has read some Goethe will probably recognize this feature of his writing. Another good example might be Nietzsche himself. In Ecce Homo, he discusses how he channeled his pain and frustration caused by his chronic illness into his work and into his philosophy. Compare this to a disunified or disorganized will. Here, someone might be driven by their aggression at one moment, then their lust at another, and then their joy, and then their pride. And each one is pulling their action in a different direction. Sometimes the drives may conflict so much that the person just doesn't act at all. There would be no consistency in how they behave. And given that drives are also behind what we value, they wouldn't have any clear value system to follow either. It reminds me a little bit of how St. Augustine describes his life before he turned to God. He says that the different desires and drives in his mind would rule over him, spinning his life in circles and ultimately causing him much misery and despair, as well as disorientation and suffering. Obviously, Nietzsche would not agree with how St. Augustine resolved these conflicts via a faith in the Christian God, but it does show how these Nietzschean insights are eminently applicable even if you do disagree with the rest of Nietzsche's philosophy. It's part of what makes discussing Nietzsche's specific psychological theories so fascinating, even if you are an ardent anti-Nietzschean. It is the unity of the drives that Nietzsche thinks makes our actions our own, and it is key to his idea of autonomy. We can think of it this way. If your drives are constantly tugging you in all different directions, making you value all sorts of different things and undermining any consistency in your behavior, then in what sense are those decisions being made by you? It would be more accurate to say that your lust was acting or that your anger was acting. It's only when all of these drives are put in their proper place that we can begin to see a consistent character and consistent set of values emerging. As Katsafanos points out, this makes autonomy a matter of degree, rather than there being a simple divide between autonomous and non-autonomous behavior and people. This is part of what separates a strong will from a weak will in Nietzsche's work. Again, this all reinforces what I would say is the primary theme of Nietzschean psychology, which is that much of our awareness of ourselves is kind of a polished, PR-friendly version of what's actually going on. We think that we value things because of arguments, but in fact, we value them because of irrational or irrational drives. We think we perceive the world just as it is, but we often perceive it through the distorting lens of a conceptual scheme. So when Nietzsche de-emphasizes the importance of our conscious mind, he is not necessarily saying that it doesn't matter at all, or it's kind of an epiphenomenon. He is trying to counterbalance our own view of ourselves, which, even now, with the benefit of another 100 years of study into the nature of the unconscious, is that we are all fully autonomous creatures with our conscious minds at the head of our wills, choosing our own path forward like a rational dictator. Even if we cognitively and scientifically know that this picture is almost certainly false, we still often act as if it were true. So arguably, Nietzsche's counterbalancing influence is just as relevant today as it was in his time. However, there is one aspect of Nietzsche's psychology that we have yet to touch upon, but it is one of his most important and most controversial concepts. If you want to help me make more videos like this and support the channel, then please consider subscribing, either to the channel or, if you're feeling very generous and want access to exclusive content, to the Patreon. The links are in the description. 3. The will to power. If you've read a lot of Nietzsche or just watched videos on him before, then you will have probably come across his idea of the will to power. Before I start this section, I just can't emphasize enough just how controversial interpretations of the will to power are. I tend to agree mainly with Bernard Regenster's interpretation, so that's the one I'll be using here. But please do bear in mind that this is only one way of viewing the concept, and there are many other highly plausible interpretations. At first, it might be tempting to think of the will to power as one of those drives that we were talking about in the last section, a drive towards power. But given just how much the will to power is brought up in Nietzsche's philosophy, and just how strangely he often uses the word power, this seems like it would be understating things. Instead, the will to power seems more like a meta-drive. It is the structure in which all drives towards action implicitly take part in. In short, Nietzsche thinks that whatever we will, and whatever our drives will, they all aim at the overcoming of resistance. Again, this is best illustrated by an example. Imagine that you are exercising your competitive drive. You want to win some sort of competition. As anyone who has easily won something can tell you, it is not nearly as rewarding as encountering resistance and then overcoming it. For Nietzsche, it's not just our competitive drive that does this. All of our drives generally follow this pattern. The satisfaction that they receive is not just from achieving the goal of the drive, but also in overcoming the obstacles to get at the object of the drive. Another good example might be romance. People often take pleasure in not just loving someone, but in the thrill of falling in love with them and them falling in love with you, despite the fact that this can be emotionally fraught and full of anxieties and fears and uncertainties and challenges. The common theme for Nietzsche is that we seek, implicitly, both to encounter some difficulty, but then also have the power to overcome that difficulty, hence the will to power. For Nietzsche, this is both a description of a general human tendency that he thinks underlies all of our drives, but also a recommendation on how to live and what to value. To understand why, we need to again revisit one of Nietzsche's primary philosophical inspirations, Arthur Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer was a die-hard pessimist, and although there were metaphysical and spiritual components to this, he also had a deeply important psychological thesis, that our wills cannot be satisfied. Schopenhauer sees that when we desire something or will it, and then achieve or attain the object of that desire or will, it doesn't bring us some kind of stable satisfaction, but instead, after a short period of time, that desire is replaced by another. As soon as we get a job we want, we start noticing what's wrong with it and craving a better one. We buy a house only to desire a bigger or more resplendent one. Our academic or professional achievements are very motivating when we're striving towards them, but as soon as we have them, we just want to get the next one. Thus, Schopenhauer recommends that we try to dampen our will as much as possible, desiring less and less until our will is as inactive as we can possibly manage. He thought that this would ideally lessen the suffering caused by having a frustrated will, and you can definitely see some of Schopenhauer's Buddhist influences here. Nietzsche at least partially agrees with this general Schopenhauerian picture. He does think that the will is unceasing, but he argues that to answer this, we don't need to stop the will entirely, but structure our will around a new goal, the goal of overcoming resistance. Nietzsche's reasoning for this, to simplify massively, is roughly as follows. If we're going to have restless wills, and we know that our drives are never really going to settle down and finally be satisfied, then how should we react? Well, if peace is just off the table, then we must learn to desire and value the striving itself. That is, we can take that observation about the satisfaction of overcoming resistance and its implicit presence in all of our drives, and turn that into the linchpin of our approach to life. Thus, when Nietzsche talks about the will to power in this narrow technical way, he's not saying that we should try to become as powerful as humanly possible in material terms. Instead, he is recommending that, in whatever we do, we learn to love this process of overcoming resistance to our desires, our drives, and our goals. This will involve some of what we normally call power, since without some degree of internal or external power, you just can't overcome anything. You're stuck at the resistant stage. But this doesn't mean that Nietzsche wants each of us to become dictators, and certainly not dictators over other people, even though he sometimes does give that impression. It's a bit confusing. I would say it's not quite as clear-cut as this, but I don't want to give the impression that Nietzsche is just recommending universal dictatorship for everyone. Instead, it's probably better seen as a description of both what satisfies us and also a prescription of how we ought to view our drives and our desires, and what we should most fruitfully value if peace and God and heaven is just off the table and unattainable. So, when Nietzsche talks about the importance of the will to power and strengthening or leaning into the will to power, we can get a clearer picture of what's behind this. Nietzsche thinks that our own drives implicitly involve the will to power anyway, and so consciously valuing overcoming resistance is a way to find value in the process of living and striving rather than in achieving permanent satisfaction, which Nietzsche is deeply skeptical of. This is why Nietzsche's philosophy is sometimes spoken of as a philosophy of becoming as opposed to a philosophy of being, because becoming is where the existential meaning and satisfaction is found. This is, again, something that Nietzsche thinks we're not generally conscious of. We don't appreciate just how important the will to power is as a mental and explanatory phenomenon, because it's operating at the level of our unconscious drives, and thus we're not generally conscious of its influence. This picture, however, still leaves a number of things unclarified, and I would like to discuss just a few of them with you now. Firstly, it's not entirely clear what the relationship between the will to power and the concept of unified drives we discussed in the last section is. They are sometimes mentioned together, and Nietzsche does paint both of them as important parts of achieving autonomy, as well as important components of his project of creating our values. But it's unclear precisely how they stick together. Sometimes it seems like Nietzsche is suggesting that the will to power is the thing we ought to value, and that this would make it the end goal of the process of the unification of our drives. When our drives are unified properly, then we should end up valuing the will to power. However, sometimes it seems like the will to power is involved in Nietzsche's description of the process of self-overcoming, and thus of unifying and organizing the drives, which then seems to paint it as intertwined with this broad project of unifying our drives. This may have been one of the aspects of his philosophy that Nietzsche would have cleared up in his never-finished 4-part magnum opus, which would have talked about both the process of revaluing values and the expanded will to power. And it's worth noting that quite a lot of the material that we have on Nietzsche's will to power, and indeed on the organization and unification of our drives, is found in his Nachlass, which is the unpublished notebooks that were published posthumously. So it seems like these were concepts that Nietzsche probably would have gone more into detail about if he hadn't just lost his mind and gone mad. For what it's worth, I prefer to see the will to power as Nietzsche's ultimate recommendation for a cornerstone of a new value system, and the organization of the drives as a slow, steady process that will hopefully eventually achieve this new valuation. And that's heavily influenced by Bernard Regenster there. If you remember in the last section, Nietzsche argued that value systems grew out of drives and particular coordinations of those drives. If this is the case, then it seems like there might be a coordination of the drives which does allow someone to value the process of striving and overcoming resistance itself. And thus, you would end up with an arrangement of the drives organized around the value of the will to power. This strikes me as a pretty nice way to tie the two concepts together, and there is some textual evidence that would support this will to power as aim interpretation. But it's also worth noting that there is textual evidence which suggests different interpretations as well, so I wouldn't be too confident in asserting this as the absolute thing Nietzsche thought. I just think it's a neat way to make these concepts play nicely. So, to put all of this together, we have 3 major ideas that constitute the bulk of Nietzsche's psychological theories so far, bearing in mind that we have been skimming over much of the detail. The first is that much of our mind's workings occur at the unconscious level. Our conscious awareness only gets at part of what's going on, and that part is almost certainly distorted, and this includes our perceptions and our ideas and our beliefs. The second is that many of the values and motivations that we think are reasonable, deliberate, and rational come from our drives, unconscious forces which vie for influence over our behavior and our value system. Part of Nietzsche's existential philosophy involves unifying these drives into a coherent, harmonious whole, and so becoming autonomous, or as he puts it later, becoming who you are. The third is that the will to power is both a huge part of what drives strive after and the way to achieve existential fulfillment in a world without permanent satisfaction, either in the form of heaven or in worldly peace. This is why Nietzsche places such importance on it, both as a way to explain human behavior and also as a way to organize a new value system. But it's worth asking, why was Nietzsche so interested in psychology and psychological theorizing? And what can we learn from his approach? Well, I'm glad that you asked, hypothetical viewer, because that is just our final point. 4. The Queen of the Sciences. Throughout his work, Nietzsche places an immense importance on psychology and psychological insight more generally. He famously referred to it as the Queen of the Sciences and thought it held the key to making progress in ethics. But why is it that he thinks this? And what can we take away more generally about Nietzsche's approach that we can apply to our own philosophies? For Nietzsche, many of us have been conceiving of ethical inquiry in a totally backwards fashion. Whereas for many people today, the study of ethics is about crafting moral laws and dictating behavior, Nietzsche's conception of ethics is more closely aligned with Greek antiquity. For him, the paramount ethical question is not what is the right thing to do, but what is the good life and how should we achieve it? That is, how do we get a life that is existentially fulfilling, that promotes human flourishing and utilizes human potential? Whereas thinkers like Kant talked about what the moral thing for any rational agent to do would be, Nietzsche was far more concerned with the particular way a human and a human mind might fulfill itself. This task just can't be done merely with armchair thinking. It must be achieved with observation and study of the human mind. This idea frames so much of Nietzsche's writings. An awful lot of them are motivated by direct study of how other people behave and how Nietzsche's own mind operated, as well as the conversations he had with other people about their own minds, including some of his friends. For Nietzsche, we needed a kind of philosophical psychology in order to truly exhaust our potential and make philosophical progress. And this was vitally important for Nietzsche's overall project of learning how we can live without God and alleviate the nihilism that he thought threatened to run roughshod over Europe. For him, we had spent so long relying on religious belief and God to tell us what to value and how to behave, and also relying on the idea of heaven and the immortal soul to make our lives seem worthwhile, that we had forgotten how to understand our own minds. And thus we would fall into despair without these externally imposed structures. Nietzsche thought that it was only in understanding our drives and our instincts that we would learn to craft new values, since these drives have a naturally value-creating component to them. And whether or not you buy into Nietzsche's particular psychology and his particular philosophy, I think this has been a vastly underestimated insight in the field of existential philosophy. We spend an awful lot of time in existential debates and in our discussions of existential questions talking about creating meaning. But this just often deflates into a sort of thought-terminating cliche where we say something like, oh, your life feels meaningless, well then just create your own meaning, man. But it's only with a detailed psychological framework that we can actually begin to think of ways that we could, in practice, achieve this. We clearly can't choose to value whatever we want. I know plenty of people who are really into food and really value a complex and sophisticated taste. I do not, and moreover, I can't just choose to value this. I really value memory and memorization, but I know lots of extremely clever and brilliant people who just don't get the same kind of fulfillment out of memorizing something as I do, and they can't simply choose to value this. So, if we're going to make creating your own meaning anything more than just a soundbite, then we need to do this kind of philosophical psychology in order to answer the details of this question and clarify exactly what is meant by this statement. This is certainly something that I've taken on board. In the past, I've spoken about just how difficult it is to value something if it doesn't chime with your pre-existing emotional and psychological inclinations, and if the people around you and in your community don't value it, or even worse, are averse to it. If this is true, then it tells you something. that crafting values is best accomplished as part of a group or part of a community. Nietzsche would disagree with my conclusion here. He actually thinks that a sufficiently well-organized set of drives can allow you to totally break free from surrounding value systems. But it is still his conception of drive and unconscious originated meaning that got me started on this line of thinking in the first place. I just have a slightly higher estimation of most people's social drives than Nietzsche does. Additionally, Nietzsche lets us know the importance of reflecting upon our own motives and our own drives without trying to sugarcoat things. If he is right, then a whole heap of the behavior that we perceive as justified and rational may be the result of inner drives that we are just not conscious of and don't fully understand. It hammers home why the old philosophical adage of knowing yourself is so very important, even when it can be painful or paralyzing to discover ourselves. For Nietzsche, it is essential to becoming autonomous and being able to say that you truly own your actions and you truly know why you're doing anything. Finally, there is the simple idea that Nietzsche takes the particular facts about observers and judges into account when we are making observations and judgments about the world. It is so easy to idealize human beings into these truth-finding machines. But, as I've spoken about before, we have so many different cognitive biases and unconscious motives influencing our judgments that this idea seems pretty overconfident, to say the least. At its best, reading Nietzsche's psychological writings and psychological insights allow us to recognize that we are guilty of these same epistemic and motivational sins that we charge others with having. And I do think that the we is very important here. It's incredibly easy to go around saying how other people are motivated by drives that they're only partially aware of, but Nietzsche continually turns our gaze inwards as he accuses us of doing the very same thing. He doesn't even think that his own mind is above this pervasive self-ignorance, as he makes clear with Ecce Homo, which lets us know exactly what he thinks drives his own philosophy and how the origin of his philosophy is also found in his own unconscious drives. Sure, he prefers his own drives, but that is only natural because the drives present themselves as value-inducing. The point is, Nietzsche does not think that he is above this messy business of the unconscious mind, and in doing so, he forces us to reflect on its influence in our own minds and in our philosophies as well. Moreover, the great thing about Nietzsche's psychological project is that it is valuable whatever you think of the rest of his ideas. You can think that his ethical program is nonsense and his overall existential philosophy is monstrous, and indeed, I have been critical of both of these. But the core foundations of his approach, incorporating human psychological insight to expose the parts of us that we would like to just pretend aren't there, and then using this knowledge to find out what might genuinely fulfill us in the absence of a metaphysical religious structure, is of undeniable insight and value. So, honestly, I would highly recommend that, if you can, you should definitely go and read Katsafanos's book. It is incredibly readable, gives much of the context to Nietzsche's psychological system, and has a real eye to what is practical about Nietzsche's philosophy, as well as obviously remaining rather faithful to his original texts. There are differences in how Katsafanos and I personally read Nietzsche, but he knows a lot more about it than I do, so if you're going to listen to someone, it should probably be him. Another good recent book on this is Matteo Riccardi's Nietzsche's Philosophical Psychology, which covers a lot of the same ground but has subtle interpretive differences that will be very interesting if you have a pre-existing background in Nietzsche. Overall, if you are going to study a single thing about Nietzsche's philosophy, it should probably be this. All of his insights here are eminently applicable to whatever your personal philosophical projects might be, and much of its broad strokes, such as unconscious motivations or the distorting nature of our conscious interpretations, have been vindicated by some modern empirical evidence and certain therapeutic techniques. It's well worth checking out, if you ask me. But if you want to see more of Nietzsche's darker philosophies, then you should check out my video on the genealogy of morals right here, where you'll find the aforementioned controversial critique of Christianity. I might do a video on Beyond Good and Evil next month, but I haven't yet decided. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.